Welcome to Instruction Discussion, our weekly look at the latest topics and trends in education affecting schools here on Long Island and schools around the world. Whether you're a teacher, parent, or student, listen for tips and strategies to help you navigate the educational landscape. There's a bell. It's time to start today's Instruction Discussion on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.
Hello, I'm Kevin Boston Hill, and welcome to Instruction Discussion, where each week we will examine a recent trend or development in education and its impact on Long Island. Being in the Northeast, we are well aware of the social and educational inequities that people from Black and Latino communities face. What we may not realize is that we do not have a monopoly on these inequities. These conditions exist in other parts of the country, and the numbers present a picture that may be even more bleak in areas outside of the Northeast. According to the Economic Vitality and Education in the South, or EVES report, Black and Latino students from low-income families in the South are more likely to live in underserved communities and attend under-resourced schools than their white and affluent peers and even students of color in other regions of the country. To discuss the results of the EVES report, its implications, and what we can do even if we are not from the South, today we welcome from the Southern Education Foundation, Raymond Pierce, President and CEO, and Meagan Crowe, Senior Research and Policy Analyst. Welcome to Instruction Discussion on 90.3 WHPC.
Thank you for having me.
Happy to be here.
No, it's my pleasure that you all were able to carve out some time for us today. Let's get right into our little discussion here and exactly tell us, what is the Southern Education Foundation? When was it created and why was it created?
Kevin, again, thank you for having us on your show this morning. The Southern Education Foundation is the nation's oldest education and equity organization. It was formed in 1867, and our roots are actually following the Civil War and even discussions just before the Civil War. The Southern Education Foundation was formed initially by George Peabody, considered one of the wealthiest men in the nation at the time, in 1867, where he saw that the United States was getting behind economically, that the Europeans were embracing the Industrial Revolution, where the United States was wedded to the agrarian economy, the agricultural economy in the South. And not only that, half the labor was enslaved in a barbaric system. And George Peabody and others felt that the United States needed to end the slavery and get these people who are enslaved educated so that we can participate in the Industrial Revolution. Well, following the Civil War, philanthropists, wealthy people like George Peabody saw that the government was moving pretty slow in educating this new massive population of people in the South. So he created a foundation, the Peabody Foundation, to build schools in the South and buy books and train teachers. And so that's why George Peabody is considered the father of modern day philanthropy. Well, a few years later, he was joined by another philanthropist, a wealthy man from Connecticut, John Slater, who did the same thing, created a foundation to build schools in the South and buy books and train teachers. And then a few years later, Anna Jeanes out of Philadelphia, considered one of the wealthiest women in the nation at the time. And she was a staunch abolitionist. She worked very closely with Frederick Douglass and eventually Booker T. Washington following the Civil War. And she focused her money, $1 million she started the Jeanes Fund. She focused her money on training teachers. So with philanthropy in the north, from the north, primarily New York, Connecticut, and Philadelphia, that partnered with African Americans who had just come out of slavery in the South, who were beginning to build their own little schools and our own schools in the South, that formed the Southern Education Foundation. And eventually, in 1934, all those foundations were consolidated to form what is today the Southern Education Foundation. We've continued to advance this mission of providing education opportunities through our research, which we're talking about today. And Meagan Crowe is an excellent example of the research we put out. That research has been used to guide policy and legislation for over 100-something years. We've also used that research to guide litigation when necessary. For example, our work in support of Thurgood Marshall and Brown versus Board of Education. We've also advanced our mission by our iconic history and our legacy of developing leaders in education. Not only are we the originators of public education in the South, because we moved for the formation of taxes right after the Civil War to pay for all this so that it could be sustained, so that philanthropy, the wealthy people weren't continuing to pay for all these books, but just like we were paying taxes for books, for bridges and roads, We ought to pay taxes for books and teachers in schools. And so eventually all this got sustained, and that is the legacy of the Southern Education Foundation. And we work to continue to support public education and all of its various facets.
I didn't realize that there was such a rich history with the Southern Education Foundation, and there's such a connection with the North as well. So there's already that there's this semblance or this idea that everybody has to come together in order to make these advancements moving forward. Well,
technically, we are still a New York company. We moved to the South, Atlanta, in 1940. But we were formed again as the Peabody Fund in New York. And then when the Slater and Jeans Fund, another foundation, the Randolph Fund, was also consolidated. When they were all eventually consolidated to form the Southern Education Foundation, we kept the headquarters in New York City. It wasn't until 1934 that we moved our headquarters south of the Mason-Dixon line into Atlanta, which is where the dominant amount of our work is.
Let me ask you this. Approximately how many students of color and low-income students are actually currently living in poverty in the South?
So we know that across the South, approximately 1 in 5 children is living in poverty. 41% of the nation's children overall reside in the SEF region and our 17-state southern and southeastern footprint, but 46% of children who live in poverty live in southern states. So that is a larger issue in the South. We also know that Black and Hispanic people overall are living in poverty at rates almost twice those of white people in the South. So 21% of Black and Hispanic people live in poverty in the South compared with 11% of white people.
Of course, these numbers sound really, really dire, and of course they are. And of course, I'm going to have some of my listeners who may say, well, yeah, that sounds tragic, but, there are people suffering here as well. So why should I care about what is happening in the South, per se, when we have our own issues right here in the North or in the West or in other parts of the country? So what would you say to something like that?
I love that question. If I may, what's really important to note is that even though the Eves report sees that a lot of these inequities are exacerbated or are worse in the South overall compared with the nation, it also points out that the U.S. as a nation is far behind many other developed countries. We have higher infant mortality rates. We have higher incarceration rates. We have lower educational attainment rates. We have higher poverty rates. We have lower employment rates. We have lower standards of living compared with other developed nations. So the South is just, a little bit further behind the nation, but the nation overall is behind the rest of the global marketplace. And the policies that would address poverty in the South in many, many terms are the same policies that would affect those issues anywhere else across the U.S. So in 2021, the poverty threshold for a family of 4 with 2 kids under 18 was $26,500, and that's in every state. So we're defining poverty as $26,000. I don't know about you. I don't know a lot of families of 4 that can live on that every year. So whether or not we're looking at the South specifically or the nation overall, there's too many Americans living in poverty. And so we can address these issues better when we all get together and decide at a national level, as well as at these local and state levels, that we need to do something about those issues.
And I'll add to that, too, Kevin. The Southern Education Foundation, sometime in the 60s and 70s, following the Great Migration. By the Great Migration, I mean the migration of African Americans from the South to the North who were escaping Jim Crowe, who moved from Georgia and the Carolinas to New York and Boston, and from Mississippi to Cleveland and Detroit and Chicago, or from Louisiana to Oakland and San Francisco and LA. That big migration that happened sometime after the Civil War and then again after World War II. Those discriminatory practices followed them. Housing practices that limited access to mortgages and capital to African Americans, the entire redlining business, all that followed Black folks from the South and poor folks from the South up to the North. So these social determinants that Meagan's talking about that are in our Economic Vitality and Education in the South report, those social determinants are not just, in the South. They follow where every Black and brown people congregate in the northern states also.
Well, we've mentioned several times about the Economic Vitality and Education Report in the South Report, or the EVES report. So let's get into the nitty gritty of it. What did this report reveal, and about how long did the study go on for?
I performed the research for the Economic Vitality and Education in the South report for 3 or 4 months, I would say. And I went ahead and collected a bunch of public use data that was comparable across states from places like the Census Bureau, the Annie Casey Foundation, and various other resources. And what the research uncovered, of course, was that a lot of the inequities that we saw brought to the forefront during the pandemic have always been there. They've always been problematic, and I think it's well understood that the pandemic really just exacerbated a lot of existing issues, such as inequities in the workforce, or the child care system kind of fell apart in the pandemic, and now there's a lot of parents who are unable to work because they don't have access to child care. Research also revealed that all of these factors are much more determining of children's outcomes in schools than anything that actually happens in the schools themselves. Children who are living in poverty, who don't have access to nutritional meals, who don't have access to high-quality medical services, who maybe live in a community where there is crime or disorganization of any kind, if their parents don't have good employment opportunities, if their parents aren't being paid a living wage, children are going to come into the classroom hungry, unable to pay attention. They're less likely to graduate from high school. They're less likely to go on to college later. And then their children are very likely to have those same results. Poverty and low educational attainment are generational issues, and our schools are not equipped, nor should our teachers be held responsible for addressing all of the inequities that cause Black children, other children of color, and low-income students to achieve educationally at rates that constantly lag their white and affluent peers. Schools cannot address those issues alone, and so the EVES report really calls for state, federal, local leaders to start thinking about these social determinants of education, all the factors in our schools, in our communities, and the policies and practices that affect children's lives, and start really thinking about how we can affect all of these other areas so that our children can come to schools, high-quality schools, highly resourced schools, ready to learn.
You are listening to Instruction Discussion on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. My name is Kevin Boston Hill, and our guests today are Raymond Pierce, President and CEO of the Southern Education Foundation, and Meagan Crowe, Senior Research and Policy Analyst of the Southern Education Foundation. Meagan, you just mentioned about some of the ills and the inequities that currently take place. And I'm sure there are a lot of people who are saying, well, yeah, duh, that's obvious. And we all know what the problems are. But what are some of the solutions? So what are some of the recommendations for our state and federal lawmakers that can be applied to address some of these disparities?
Thank you for that question. Recommendations can vary. We, in the EVES report, we give many recommendations in several different policy areas for state, local, and federal lawmakers to look at and choose from. So we have various recommendations around poverty and food insecurity that involve, increasing funding for various programs that are already in place to treat those things, like the Earned Income Tax Credit or Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Programs. There's also housing and community type policies where we talk about really investing in historically under-resourced communities and making sure that there are medical services there, that there are grocery stores available, that there are jobs to employ families. We have recommendations that revolve around the criminal justice system and student discipline. Across the U.S., we incarcerate Black males at an alarming rate compared with others. 1 in every 81 Black people in the U.S. is serving time in jail. And our incarceration rates compared with the rest of the world are out of this world. They're much, much higher than other places. So, getting rid of prison sentences for low-level crimes, or providing more social, emotional development for our teachers so that Black and brown students aren't over-identified for disciplinary issues. Those are just a few ideas.
And Raymond, I want you to chime in as well, because I know you gave us, at least gave me, a pretty good reminder of the history of, like, when you started mentioning about the Great Migration and so forth. So why do you think some of those historical inequities continue to exist and follow us, even though we've left the South and we've left parts of the country? Why do these historical inequities continue?
I'd like to answer that, Kevin, but before I do, I want to say this also. Just following up on something Meagan just said, the reason why it's so important for us not to just focus totally on the school itself, not to give in to the easy answer of, well, the schools are bad. Is that because those are not the answers? As Meagan points out, there are a number of factors, a number of variables that impact a child's ability to learn. But it becomes politically expedient and politically useful for those who want to redirect public education dollars to not look at all these other social determinants, to not look at the food situation for Black and brown children in economically depressed areas, to not look at the crime in their community, to not look at the health conditions in their community, to simply say the schools are bad, therefore let's take the money from the public schools and give it to a private school. So we've got to get way beyond these simple, I call it naive and kindergarten, responses to what clearly are complex issues in education. Now, why do I think these factors continue today? Because they were baked into our public education system. Not only our public education system, our criminal justice system, our healthcare system, our economic system, racism was baked into it long after the Civil War ended. During Jim Crow, the laws that limited African Americans' ability to gain access to capital, to go to particular schools, to go to certain hospitals, to move in particular neighborhoods, that was all on the books. And during the Great Migration, when African Americans thought they were escaping the South and this oppression and moved north, they ran into the same thing. Redlining, right in the books, covenants that says blacks can't move into this neighborhood. They don't have access, can't have access to bank loans. They're going to pay. African Americans are paying twice as much for rent in the same apartments that whites vacated when blacks moved to the north from the South. And so all of these continuing, discriminatory practices that were actually by law make it impossible to think that less than 50, 100 years later, that there would not be leftovers, there would not be vestiges, there would not be continuing elements of that practice of not only disenslavement, but the practice of discrimination and segregation.
Now, of course, you'll get no argument from me regarding that when you mentioned that the schools are not necessarily the problem that we need to face, because we tend to look at schools, in my opinion, we tend to look at schools as the ultimate solution. So whenever something happens within a community, we go to the schools. We go to, whether it's a negative or in some cases even a positive, but we expect the schools to do too much. And so I want to shift gears just a little bit and talk about the report that the Southern Education Foundation did, the study they did regarding teachers' stress and burnout, because we know, especially during this pandemic, we've seen the levels of stress among teachers really skyrocket because they've been expected and asked to do a lot more than they're already asked to do a lot. And now we're asking them to do even more. So what did that study, the study on teacher stress and burnout, what happened during that study that our teachers kind of will say, well, yeah, we know this, but we need the rest of the world to hear this?
I would say that the teacher stress and burnout report really revealed that our teachers just basically deserve more of the support. They deserve access to more professional development opportunities, to social emotional support. They need counseling. They need time with their families. And they need the time to implement all of these things. So if we're asking them to spend an extra hour in their day to go and get some professional development, we need to give them that time. Every expectation that we have of teachers just sounds. They're bringing all of this work home. They're exhausted. And on top of it, they're having to field a bunch of angry parents, quite frankly, a bunch of parents who are concerned about their children. And so we need to be supporting our teachers in how to manage that level of stress. But I think as well, we also need to make sure that we are educating our district leaders, our administrators within schools to make sure that they too understand how to develop cultures and how to implement policies that really rely on the good knowledge of teachers. You know, the teachers are in the classroom. They're our first measure of what is going on. And we need to do a better job of listening to them. We need to do a better job of not just passing top-down policies because we want to collect data really for financial purposes at the end of the day sometimes, but we want to make sure that our teachers are getting to affect the changes that they see that their students need. As well, I think it's really important to point out that higher poverty schools and schools that are predominantly attended by Black and Brown students do not have the same high quality teachers in them very often. Very often, the teachers that end up serving our most needy or underserved students are in their first 5 years. They're fresh out of school, and research shows that teachers really become much more effective after that first 5 years, after they have had the practice and the support to figure out good classroom management skills and how to deliver the curriculum and how to make those connections with students. So the teachers who are in the schools where our students need them the most are often the ones who have the fewest resources. And on top of it, they're in schools that are under-resourced overall. They don't have the same high-quality materials. They don't have the same high-quality books. A lot of those students don't have internet access at home. They don't have access to computers or any kind of device. And so we're asking teachers to bridge this huge educational gap. We have students coming in and out of the classroom. We have students who are turning in homework or not, and they're supposed to address the needs of 20, sometimes 30 students at a time in this, really fluctuating environment. And we need to make sure that teachers are getting the additional support that they need to manage all of these different things. And that's not just giving them the support so that they can do it. That's also making sure that we're putting in the resources and the additional people to help pick up some of that slack. So that's that's a couple of major findings from that report.
If I may, Kevin, the Southern Education Foundation carries out its mission of advancing education opportunity and equity primarily in three ways. Through our leadership development operation, developing leaders who can manage our systems of public education, who can lead in classrooms, who can manage schools, who can manage districts. Our government affairs and advocacy section, which works to develop policies and implement policies and work with legislators to adopt more equitable and fair education policies and practices for greater resources for the people who need it the most. And then our research and policy unit which Meagan is a part of. And the research is not just research that we put up on the shelf, but research that we use to put into the hands of not just policymakers, but also people who run school districts to help guide them in how to better manage our schools for the betterment of our children. When the pandemic hit, one of the first pieces of research pieces that we put out was a piece or guidelines on how to deal with the digital divide, as Meagan pointed out. Schools were shutting down and they were sending students home to learn remotely, and the digital divide emerged again. It never went away. But we realized that not all these children have laptops at home. If they do, they don't have someone at home who can give them some assistance in how to manage working on a computer or doing their education on the computer. You have schools, communities that don't have internet services. So that digital divide report guidelines that we put out early in the pandemic was to help guide not just legislators who create the policies that impact our schools, but also the leaders, the school leaders themselves. It didn't take long that we began to hear from our networks of school leaders, and we have a large network of school district superintendents who are part of a program that the Southern Education Foundation has been running for well over 100 plus years, that teacher stress was beginning to mount in the early days of the pandemic, and there was very little going on to address it. So the report we put out was call attention to it, get it into the hands of state and local leaders and some federal leaders to begin action and conversations around policies and practices and initiatives that could be taken to address this. Because the last thing we want to do is burn out our teacher workforce, just like we're burning out our healthcare workforce during this pandemic.
No, I think that's a wonderful idea. And I think we need to really get, like you say, get this information into the hands of the people who can do something about it. So with that said, where can people go to find out if they wanted to read about the EVES report or the teacher stress and burnout reports themselves or any other information? Where can they go to get these documents and any other information that the Southern Education Foundation has put out?
People can find the EVES report and the teacher stress and burnout report, as well as other resources, all on our website, southerneducation.org.
If you had a couple of last words, what would you like to leave our audience with?
Well, the importance of taking a look at this information, Kevin, and applying it across the board. I mean, what you opened up with is that this is not just the South. This, as W.B. Du Bois said, and I'm somewhat paraphrasing, as goes the South, so goes the nation. And if we're beginning to see an exacerbation of these inequities in the South, they're only going to continue in the North. But most importantly, what we like to take away from this is that a new way of looking at this, and that is to quit just saying that the reason why Johnny's reading levels are not where they should be is because the school is bad. To quit just looking at the school. That is too simple a response, and it gives way to political shenanigans, in my strong opinion. We have to look at all the social determinants around why that child is not learning. Schools don't just exist on an island. They exist in communities that are impacted by poverty, a lack of food supplies, social disorder, crime, whatever. All those things negatively impact a child's ability to learn. So the more we look at all those determinants, the better we can put together some more thoughtful responses and solutions to make sure that all our children have the opportunity to learn to the fullest degree of their potential.
The last thing that I would like to add is that everybody benefits from a thriving, diverse workforce. And the way that we get a thriving and diverse, innovative, creative workforce that is able to generate economic activity that benefits us all is by preparing everyone. White males alone are not going to create a nation in which we all thrive. We need everybody. So we need everybody to have the same opportunities to reach high educational attainment levels, to have access to good food, good medical care, high quality, affordable housing, affordable or better yet, free childcare. Because at the end of the day, if we have more people who are more educated, who are making more money, who have stable employment, their kids are going to have those too, and their children as well. And we all do better when we're all doing better. We don't do well together by keeping half of the nation depressed in a cycle of generational poverty. We all thrive when we all do well. And we actually spend less money on programs that help people all do well. We spend more money on welfare programs that yield less results. Diversity is the answer for everyone.
We would certainly like to thank our guests today from the Southern Education Foundation, the president and CEO, Mr. Raymond Pierce, and senior research and policy analyst, Ms. Meagan Crowe, for coming on our show today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kevin.
Once again, my name is Kevin Boston Hill, and thank you all for listening to Instruction Discussion right here on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.